Welcome to the Socio-Ecological Model for Health podcast. In this podcast, we're going to examine the actual model itself. We're going to look at its dual purpose in the terms of health promotion. So what is it? It's a conceptual model. So what that means is it is a basic model that is there to try to gain or add understanding to how people either reduce their health status or outlines how health status of an individual is not influenced by just beliefs, values and attitudes and therefore their behaviours, but also by the interrelationship between the other facets such as personal relationships, community and societal factors. So why do we use it? Understanding how these levels and factors interact allows us to firstly plan a public health approach in order to be able to prevent harm and illness to an individual. That will create a multifaceted intervention or a multifaceted approach because we're hitting it at different levels of society, not just at the individual, but all the way up at the top at a societal level and all of the different environments and the different levels which interact below. The second reason we might use it is to identify a deeper understanding of what the pathways are towards an unhealthy behaviour. So we can actually use it to identify potential risks, and by breaking it down into its subsequent levels, we can see how those risks interact between the different levels and also at what level they're most primarily set to risk. So how does the model work? Well, individual behaviour is a result of complex interplay of 5 different but interacting levels. So to break that down, what it means is the relationship and the interplay and the interaction between each of the risk factors at all of those levels will cause people to behave in a particular way. So obviously those different levels are individual relationships, social factors, cultural factors, environmental factors. What it will also allow us to do, or how it will work, is it identifies in each level factors that make up the complexities of our life. Okay, so each of those different levels will have a different complexity or a different amount of factors which make up that level. And as we said before, this idea of interplay, each level invariably overlaps and interacts with one another. So obviously if I'm hanging out with a group of people, my individual relationships with other people will be dictated by my behaviour, and therefore their relationships and their behaviour will be interacted and determined by how I behave. Alright, why is it important for health promotion? Well, what health promoters can do is they can actually apply this model to understand the multifaceted nature of human behaviour and how decision making is actually made. We can explore the relationships between individual and contextual factors, so we can see how different levels interact to create the overall behaviour or the negative effects of health. We can consider human behaviour as a product of the multiple levels of influence on behaviour. Right. So the model itself, as we said, is made up of 5 different levels: the individual, the interpersonal, the organisational, the community and the societal. As we spoke about before, if we see the combination of all of the different factors which make up each of those different levels, our resultant is our behaviour. So if we look at the interplay between all of the 5 levels, we will be able to dictate and understand at a deeper level why people behave the way they do. So if we have a look at the socio-ecological model itself, as we said, each individual level will have its own independent factors which will establish what comes at that level. So, again, looking at this idea of a socio-ecological model and a multifaceted response, health promotion can act at each of these levels of the framework to prevent unhealthy behaviours. Because we're intervening and creating a program at each of those different levels, we are multifaceted and comprehensive in our approach. Promotion will also be most effective when it's actioned across all levels. Prevention strategies should include a continuum of activities that address multiple levels of the model. These actions should be developmentally appropriate and conducted across the lifespan. What that means is we need to ensure that before we intervene, before we start our program, we need to conduct a needs assessment so we understand what level of development our population is at, what risk factors they need to obviously try to reduce, and then also make sure that we're not having just a one-off intervention, that lifelong learning is taking place and we're intervening and trying to reduce the risk across their entire lifespan, not just at a youth age or at an older age. The approach is more likely to sustain prevention efforts over time than any single intervention. Okay, so just as I said, if we try to have lifelong learners and try to increase their capacity and empower the people over an extended period, it's more likely to be sustained and sustainable. Alright, so why multiple levels? Dealing with behaviour change across a range of levels involves addressing all of the following. Firstly, we're going to address individual risk factors and taking steps to modify individual risk behaviours. Close personal relationships and working to create healthy family environments, as well as providing help and support for dysfunctional families. What that'll do is actually enhance the relationship in which individual risk factors are potentially created. Public places such as schools, workplaces and neighbourhoods, and taking steps to address the problems that might lead to harm or illness. As we know, each individual community can make up its own specific population, and with that it can have its own inherent risks, its own inherent traditions, its own inherent norms. So it is important to hit at that level. Another reason we can also hit at a multiple level is to address gender equality and adverse cultural attitudes and practices. So we've looked at this in quite depth, looking at cultural traditions, so hopefully we have a greater understanding of why that's important. Alright, let's example. So a typical waste style question, using the socio-ecological framework as an example, identify 5 factors that could lead to an individual experiencing a high risk of road trauma. So what we're doing in this case is we're actually looking at the ecological or the socio-ecological framework used as an identifying tool to understand at greater depth why people suffer from a health issue. Now you'll notice that it does ask us to identify 5 factors. Now it doesn't say it specifically, but every time, because it says socio-ecological framework, it's applied that it works more effectively and more comprehensively if we use all of the range of the different levels. So although it doesn't say from each of the 5 levels, it is implied that you actually should use individual, interpersonal, organisational, community and societal. So you need to identify a risk from each of those levels to discuss why an individual is experiencing a high risk of road trauma. Alright, let's have a look at the individual level. So, from an individual standpoint, so risk number 1, we could look at skills and capacity. So if someone has poor driving skills, either poor reflexes or poor control over a motor vehicle, that could cause them to have a higher risk of road trauma. Their demographic could also be something which might be needed to be looked at as a risk factor. Typically, young age may mean limited driving experience. At the same age, young males typically take greater risks than someone of a female gender or of a higher age. We could also look at literacy level. So individuals may be unaware about the need to service their vehicles or the minimum standards for safe vehicles, so hence might be driving with poor brakes, broken windshields, broken seat belts, all of the different factors which may contribute to an accident. Alright, from an interpersonal level, we could look at reflection. So the individual may have seen an authority figure, someone like their parents, driving recklessly. This might cause them to believe that driving recklessly is appropriate, and they might have a positive attitude towards risk-taking, such as doing burnouts or speeding. We might have something along the lines of peer pressure. So the individual may be in the car with friends who are influencing them to drive fast, or potentially under the influence of alcohol. So in this level, we are talking about the interaction between different people, and generally, as a golden rule, if we associate with people who demonstrate positive behaviours, we're inclined and more likely to demonstrate positive behaviours. On the other hand, or the flip side, if someone that you hang out with or associate with demonstrates negative behaviours, you're more unlikely to also demonstrate negative behaviours. Alright, from an organisational point of view, we might have a lack of policy. So looking at a workplace, in this case, the workplace may not have regulations in place that reduce the prevalence of fatigue while driving. So an example could be in other workplaces there's a 2-hour then rest policy where people have to only drive for 2 hours before resting or switching drivers. If that wasn't the case in this particular organisation, well, that will increase the risk of driving tired and therefore road fatality and trauma. Within the organisation, the equipment used may be poor, so the work vehicles provided to staff may be below standard and unsafe. They may have bald tyres, they may have brake lights or lights which aren't functioning, which might increase their. Alright, at a community level, we may have specific group norms as discussed earlier, so community norms. There may be a norm in the society that promotes or accepts speeding or drink driving. So the whole idea that, it won't happen to me, it's okay to only have a few, that might be typical and normative within that society. If we look at the environment themselves within the community, the road or the infrastructure may be unsafe or just poor in general. So there may be a large number of potholes or black zones which might contribute to a higher risk of road trauma. Alright, looking at the societal, so the overarching system which controls or underpins each of these levels. Let's have a look at law and policy. So the punishment for breaking road rules may not be or may not create enough of a disincentive to reduce unsafe behaviours. So the fine system might not be low enough. Now, I've discussed this in class before when we spoke about this idea of cognitive dissonance, where it might be a value to look cool or to drive fast, so that way you are impressive in front of people. At the same time, money might also be something which is valued. Now, if the fine system or the fine which is put in place for showing or demonstrating these negative behaviours is not high enough, there isn't enough cognitive dissonance created for me to, or for the person involved to actually change that negative behaviour. So the example that I gave to you in class was when I was driving and I was on my P plates, the fine involved for speeding 0 to 9 was only $25. So we found that a large number of people continued to speed until the fine system was increased. And if you look at it nowadays, I think it's $150 or something along those lines for speeding, which is much more of a disincentive. Alright, we might also have campaigns from authority figures. So the federal government does act as an authority figure because they have the ability to promote positive behaviours or restrict negative behaviours. Now, in this case, they may not have created enough awareness or created a sufficient prescriptive norm to reduce dangerous driving practices. This will all increase the rate of road trauma and the prevalence of road trauma. Now, an example. Using the socio-ecological framework as an example, I identified 5 strategies that could reduce the risk of an individual experiencing a high risk of road trauma. So pretty much exactly the same question. As you can see, it's asking us to use our socio-ecological framework as our model. And so when we see that, we should be identifying again that it is most effective when we're using a multifaceted approach, hence using all 5 levels which are interacting and demonstrate that interplay. What we're doing in this case is we're actually using the framework for its other intention, which is to be able to create a comprehensive multifaceted approach to fix those risks. So you need to come up with 5 strategies. You can use the Ottawa Charter to help guide you. However, it's not necessary for you to outline the different action areas. Now, inherently, each of the action areas will fit more effectively into different levels. So things like developing personal skills generally works very, very well at an individual level as well as a community level. Things like environmental or creating supportive environments typically works very, very well at a community level. Things like building healthy public policy generally works incredibly well at a societal level. So your turn. So I would suggest that that would be a fantastic question for you to practice. Alright, and looking at a past waste question, just to give you some more background. Identify 3 domains in the socio-ecological model of health. So what you need to be really careful with here, we've discussed them as levels. They can also be discussed as domains. So if you do see that word domains or levels, please do not get thrown by it. All it's asking for you is to identify and discuss the risks or the factors which are created at each of the levels. Now in this case you only have to nominate 3. Now for each, provide an example of a strategy that could be used to prevent alcohol consumption combined with swimming. So in this case you need to talk about a prevention strategy that you could put into place within 3 of the socio-ecological model of health levels.